Welcome to the Bloomberg Equality Conference Pay Transparency Briefing. I'm Shelly Banjo. I'm our New York Bureau Chief here at Bloomberg News, and I'll be moderating this discussion. Before I get started, I just want to say thank you to our presenting sponsor, Syndio, and also remind those of you tuning in at home that if you have any technical issues, go to that little red box in the corner. Sorry, not red, the little box in the corner, and type in any of your issues. Also, that can be used as a chat box. And don't be shy if you are interested in anything you hear here. Go online, tweet about it, post about it, hashtag Bloomberg Equality. So with that, I will get started. Thank you guys so much for joining us today. Let me just introduce the panel real quick. Maria Colacurcio, CEO of Syndio. Nicole Mason, President and CEO of Institute for Women's Policy Research. And Marisa Sternstein, Associate General Counsel of Dentsu. So thank you guys. I want to start with Maria. I want you to kind of set the stage for us here. Tell us kind of what does this new age of pay transparency mean? What are we kind of talking about here?
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for having me today. It's great to see all of you in person. What a treat. So I think the interesting thing when we think about pay transparency is that transparency for transparency's sake is somewhat useless. Transparency as a driver for accountability, that means something. And as we look at what's happening right now, for a long time, companies have been making performative statements about how they value their people. And that's been going on for ages, and it hasn't moved the needle. There's been no action. And what we're seeing today is a confluence of events that has the potential to actually drive action. And transparency is part of that because, again, it drives accountability. So what's the confluence of events? So the first, I think, is generational. So if you look at millennials as the plurality in the workforce, and then add on to that Gen Z, these folks share. They share everything. They share their salaries, they share what they're doing, they share their feelings about their employer, they share. It is just a generational change in how people look at their employers. They want their employers to prove that their employers are worth their labor. So that's a big shift. The second shift is legislation. So legislation is typically a laggard, but we're seeing an acceleration in legislation with things like the pay transparency laws that we're here to talk about. New York City, Colorado, you've got Washington State with a bill on the table, but those salary transparency laws are nothing compared to what we're now seeing in California. There's a bill introduced around median pay gap disclosure, which would be a wholesale shift in how we need to think about this. And then the third is investors. So you've got the institutional investors really pushing to see how workplace equity is embedded as a core tenet of leadership because that provides stability, which then creates enduring value. So the institutional investors are pushing for this. And then on the other side, you have the activist investors, also driving pay equity and pay transparency as a part of what they want to see through shareholder proposals. So all of those things that are happening right now are acting as an accelerant that I think has great potential to move us from standing around admiring the problem of the pay gap to actually solving it.
I want to bring Nicole in here. When we say pay transparency, are we just literally at the very core basic of it, meaning people should be able to know what the person next to them get paid, or does it go further into pay equity? And can you kind of put some numbers around it based on your research?
So I want to start out by thinking about the gender pay gap. So since 1972, that's about 50 years, the pay gap has only closed about 20 cents. So it's super glacial. And so we've been thinking about how at IWPR, how do we accelerate the closing of the pay gap? And it's a combination of things. So it's pay transparency, it's policies around pay data disclosure, it's enforcing anti-discrimination, pay discrimination laws, it's accountability, but it's also thinking about how the private and public sector work together. When I think about, so we have the pay gap, and then we also think about pay transparency, which for us, we think about pay secrecy. So employers being employees being discouraged from discussing pay. So while there are anti-secrecy laws on the books, it's illegal for an employer to prohibit you from discussing your pay. What we found is that there's no formal prohibition, it's more informal. So, and when we think about informal policies around discussing pay, women are often the ones who lose out. So when I talk about it, I talk about the need to democratize pay, make it fair, make it transparent, make it equal. Employers that are that way, transparent, really think about like their pay transparency or pay is a part of their growth plan. It's a way of valuing employees. Those employers do better.
Speaking of employers, I want to bring you in here. This is something that a lot of people say in theory they like, but they're probably more nervous behind closed doors. What does this mean? How's this going to change your company? What are the companies that you're working with? What are they talking to you about? What are they most concerned about?
Yeah, I think Maria and Nicole have teed it up very nicely. This has been such an incredible accelerator, just the legal change, the social movements behind pay transparency, and it's moving at such a rate that really corporations are lagging and not leading in this space, and they're forced to venture, I think, in many times outside of their comfort zone. So in today's environment, for companies to really attract and retain talent, they have to have not only the infrastructure, which is really important, and we could talk a little bit more about that, but the commitment. And the commitment isn't just lip service and saying, oh yes, these are the things I stand for, and getting up there, with a nice PowerPoint slide. It's very different now. Companies need to show demonstrable change. They need to be able to show how they're actively working to reduce and remove barriers to, bias, to equity, to help to ensure that they're removing anything that would get in the way of potentially having a pay or opportunity gap within their organizations. And I think that that is a big shift. And I think, Maria highlighted nicely the generational shift that Gen Z and those coming into the workforce, they feel differently about pay and how they talk about pay than some of the people that have been in the workforce and maybe some of the leaders within our organizations do. So it's all catching up very quickly. And it's a critical time for employers to really take a stance to embrace these new laws, figure out what their equity vision is, articulate that, and then having those KPIs and metrics that demonstrate that they're really, walking the talk.
What are the laggards so afraid of? Like, if I'm a CEO of a company, why am I scared of this?
Well, I think that there are some potential downsides. Even companies that have taken a very open approach to pay equity have seen some labor issues or unrest within their populations. It is a difficult issue to explain, and you need to make sure that your managers and your leaders are able to actually talk through why pay decisions are made, why certain decisions and policies are the way that they are. And that is something that is very difficult in a large organization that requires stakeholder alignment, from the legal team, from the DEI team, from HR, from your business leaders, that it requires accountability, right? That the leaders are actually, their performance is based on the activities that they do and, the actual performance that they're getting, whether they're KPIs that are, DEI related or, wage related or ESG related, whatever those metrics are. These are the things that need to be put forward, but these are things that are all very new. So whenever there's change and growth, it's going to be uncomfortable. And I think we're all at that stage right now.
Maria, tell us what the New York City law is and what the Colorado and California, kind of explain to us about those three things.
Yeah, of course. And I think to your last question, what are people afraid of? Let's talk about California first. So the introduction of a median pay gap disclosure bill is a massive shift. This is not about pay. So it's called median pay gap, but it's not about pay at all. It's about opportunity. It's about distribution, representation. And make no mistake, this is a full body scan. So companies are very concerned about this because when you think about it, the more you have to explain what your organization looks like when you're disclosing opportunities and where people are represented in your organization, the more you look sort of lame. If you have to keep explaining and talking about why do I have a massive pay gap, and one of the big things about the California median pay gap disclosure law is, number one, it's not just for companies in California. If you have even one employee in California, this will be a requirement for your company. And unlike what we see in the UK right now, this is going to be US based, and it's not just going to be gender. You will also have to disclose race, ethnicity. It won't be just an aggregate. You will have to do it by the EEO1 group. So there will literally be nowhere to hide. So when you think about what companies are afraid of, they are afraid of this because this is everything laid bare. And it's so much bigger than, I think what's being covered a lot in the news right now are these pay transparency laws. These are important and they're interesting. And they're requiring that on your job postings that are public in New York City, Colorado, Washington State has one that's just been introduced, you post salary information. So what is the salary range for a new role? So that's really important because what it gives is gives existing employees the ability to see, okay, I'm an engineer and I want to know what salary range my company is using to hire a new engineer. So again, it gives employees that ability to see how they're being valued, and it gives transparency around that. But again, that's the like for like. That's pay equity, which is absolutely foundational to this. The median pay gap, again, not about pay, is much, much bigger, which with huge implications.
With Colorado, we've seen some job postings pop up that say, remote work okay, you can work anywhere in the US except for in Colorado. Are
Yeah.
you worried, like, is it gonna be except for Colorado and California and New York, and then you have to move to like Utah to be able to work?
Well, so I think that was something that
No
companies,
offense to Utah.
Yeah, that's what something companies did at the beginning, and that's what companies are not going to be able to do moving forward. So it was kind of okay when you said, you know, with the exception of Colorado. But when you add New York City, when you add California, when you add Washington State and Oregon, and then it goes federal, because as goes California, goes the nation, you cannot hide from this. And again, when you think about pay transparency and putting a salary range on open roles, that's big. Having to disclose your pay gap is massive. I mean, just think about what happened with Twitter last week. So International Women's Day, I don't know if any of you saw this, there was a gender pay gap bot. And for every company that posted a performative message about International Women's Day, the gender pay gap bot would immediately respond with that company's stated UK pay gap. So companies like Bow Avenue, a lingerie company with 60,000 followers based out of London, has a 31% pay gap in favor of men. This is a company that talks about empowering women of all shapes and sizes. They posted something beautiful about their message, and immediately the gender pay gap bot was 31% pay gap in favor of men. That is everyone's reality when this median pay gap bill goes through. That is every company's reality, but instead of just gender, it's race, ethnicity, it's far beyond.
Dr. Mason, I want to talk to you about, you know, measuring this stuff, because we've seen, talking about the EOC filings, we've seen companies disclose their measurement of race and gender, and you know, for some tech companies, that hasn't changed in, you know, a decade, and talk about how slow it was to close the gender pay gap. So what do you think will change about this?
Well, I think that we do have states that are leading, and states are often laboratories, and businesses are, you know, required by law to comply. And so when we ask what are companies afraid of, we can be very honest. A company doesn't want to be exposed for having a really big gender gap, and it might feel punitive. And so if we can help to reframe and say, we know that you want to do better by your employees, by race and gender, and we're going to work to close the gap. I think that's a way to bring companies into the conversations in a different way. One of the biggest challenges that I think we don't talk about, you know, as much as we should, is the culture around pay equity and how we think about pay between men and women. Hiring managers have biases when they are thinking about when a woman is sitting and negotiating pay versus when a man is sitting and negotiating pay. Women are often penalized for negotiating pay, and so are people of color. And so really thinking about you know, how we tackle not only the technical part, the laws, the legal part, but also shifting gender norms and expectations around, you know, who's the primary breadwinner in a family, how we think about women who negotiate pay, all of these things really go hand in hand when we are thinking about these things.
What's the economic benefit, to the companies on a micro level, but also on a macro level, and what's the competitive advantage from paying people equally?
So when companies pay equally or have a fair and equitable compensation scheme, we think it helps with the retention. There's not a lot. So when I'm talking about pay transparency, I said, well, the company is in a bind. So the hiring manager, for example, is charged with attracting top talent, getting people in the door, but also protecting the bottom line of the company. And so if we have a compensation scheme where people are paid the same amount for a particular role, and you can see it's on the website, I think it encourages trust. I think employees feel valued. And when we talk about, so that's at the macro level, at the employer level. But we also know that when women are compensated fairly and they stay, women do well in jobs. They produce. It increases the bottom line for companies. And when we think about if we were able to raise the pay gap or raise pay for the lowest paid workers, we would move 50% of women out of poverty. So these are very real things, and we talk about community economic boosts as well. So there are a lot of benefits, but I think companies need to get there and be able to quantify the benefits for their individual company.
Marisa, I want to go over to you. Can you name any companies that have been leaders in this, or give any examples?
The one company that comes to mind that I think was a leader before we were even up here, having this discussion before the Equality Summit was even a thing, was really Salesforce. So Mark Benioff has always been someone I personally admired, but he went out in 2018, before many companies and people were having these conversations about pay equity, and he went on 60 Minutes, which is probably every, general counsel's nightmare, right? The CEO going on 60 Minutes, and he talked about pay equity. He talked about his personal passion for pay equity, which I think came across as authentic and warm and approachable, and then also was very candid, extremely candid with the public about the pay gap and the pay equity issues that they found at Salesforce. And he made a public commitment to saying that he was going to do everything in his power to help to bridge that gap. And year after year, Salesforce has come forward publicly, on their website in a blog, talking about each year they found what the pay gap is, how much they spent on fixing any gaps or inequities that they found in the system. And so far, at least from where I sit, that seems to be a smashing success. Mark Benioff is someone that is prided as an advocate, someone that comes across, again, as authentic and committed to his people and his mission. And I think that really is an example of leadership in this area.
You don't have to name names, but what are some things that don't work? What are some things you've seen that have just not worked?
Well, I think Maria's example with the PayBot was a really, really good one, frankly. But companies that are coming out and saying, we have this commitment to X, Y, or Z, that's not enough these days. Your employees, your shareholders are going to say, prove it. And what you want to do from a company's perspective is you want to get ahead of that curve. What you don't want is a shareholder initiative that's forcing you to disclose certain pay information before you might be ready, and you might look as if you're opposed to it for some reason, which obviously looks like you're trying to potentially hide something or not be transparent and forthright. That is something that, the day of reckoning, I think, is potentially coming for a lot of employers. And having the tools and the ability to preempt that and be a leader is going to be really critical here.
If you take New York City as an example, just because we're here, if companies wait till I think it goes into effect May, right? Or something like that. If it goes into effect in May, are you going to gain any benefit by kind of, front running that, kind of doubling down and being like, yes, we are going to buy into this 100%? Or is that going to be the same for companies like quietly discloses the things to the city government that it has to do? Does a company kind of gain establishing credibility? I don't know if you want to take that one.
Sure. Yeah, I think that you do. I think we all have a heads up now of what's coming. And companies that are getting ahead of this are garnering credibility from their people, which is the most important thing. And you can garner credibility from your people right now because you can do the right thing. And even a company of our size, Syndio, we have 140 people. We are not required yet to post salary ranges on our job postings, but we do it. And we do it because we want our people to know what we are bringing new employees in at. Because market rates right now are skyrocketing. They're out of control. And so if you aren't using technology to ensure that your existing employees are keeping pace, they are going to find out. And again, they might not find out through a salary transparency law. They might find out from having a salary party or from creating a Google spreadsheet where everyone puts in their salary. They may find out in a variety of ways, but they will find out. So I think anything companies can do to get ahead of this, look at the companies that are already disclosing their pay gap and look at the companies who aren't. So there are a lot of companies that talk a lot about the gender pay gap. They talk a lot about the race pay gap, but yet they themselves do not disclose their pay gap. The reckoning is coming where you can't decide, you can't have a say in whether you do that or not. So I think there is a tremendous amount of benefit in getting ahead of it and doing the right thing by your employees. You will garner trust and credibility from your people in doing it ahead of time.
Yeah.
Can I just say that when I think about what you just said, I think about the cost to businesses, which I think is a very real thing. We did, when I first came on board at IWPR 2.5 years ago, salaries were a little bit all over the place, and we're a small organization, and so I was committed to pay transparency, and we created a compensation scheme. And when we got back our data, there were gaps in pay and race, across race, gender, roles, and one, having to disclose that, so now we have the information, but then also working to fix it, which means that you might have to pay people more. You might have to make adjustments and retro pay. And so for businesses, especially larger ones, there is an economic consideration when they're thinking about instituting compensation schemes, pay transparency, because if there are gaps, you're going to have to work to close those gaps. And you might have to do it year over year because of the market. So, I think that's also a consideration.
Absolutely. I have some more questions, but we have such a nice group out here. I wanted to open it up to you guys to see if we have any questions from the audience. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Marisa, question for you. The OFCCP just announced they're going to be doing the pay audits with companies now. What's your thoughts on it? And then also the push for them to make the analysis that our companies are doing not disclosable, so not under privilege. What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, so that's a new development. I think, the OFCCP, just, for those, it applies only to those with government contracts, and that's a very powerful tool in addition to state laws and city laws to propelling change. Again, I think it's more of what Maria was talking about, just pushing companies with legislation, with, the government, executive orders to disclose beyond what they have been disclosing, in the hopes that, obviously, there's accountability, right? And that they're taking proactive steps to address any of the potential things that might make, that number not look like a number that the company's really comfortable with, right? Like, are there opportunity gaps? What are we doing to fuel the pay gap? I think Nicole's example about the market demands of newer employees coming in and how that impacts current employees. All of these factors have a very real impact on what those numbers are going to be. So it's just another reminder to employers that you really have to stay on top, and technology is a key way, right, to be looking in real time, especially in this age of the great resignation, where employees are leaving and being hired at just a rate that companies have never seen before, that you need to constantly be keeping tabs on where you are. And technology has really been a game changer in that sense.
And then the aspect about the analysis that companies do, it's always been protected under privilege by our legal teams. If that goes away, what do you think the impact is going to be? from a legal standpoint?
Yeah, I don't know if it will necessarily go away. I do think the privilege is around and alive and well, and there are reasons for doing things under privilege to strike the right balance between ensuring that companies are able to take affirmative steps and take a look at their data without potentially exposing the company to widespread claims. And data is something that does need to be contextualized, for job location, to make sure that they're really similarly situated employees, and are there other factors, performance, skill set, et cetera, that might explain a pay gap. So there are reasons for doing things under privilege. I don't think that that's going away necessarily, but I do think that these new transparency laws are really forcing companies to wake up, pay attention, and have a very clear narrative and clear demonstrable movement that they're making towards change, right? Again, the simple soundbite of, oh, I'm committed to pay equity, I'm committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion, that's nice, but that's not going to cut it anymore.
Sure.
Hi, piggybacking off of that, which is really great. So my question for all three, when you think about the climate that we're in now, how companies are committed to making commitments, if you will, what types of conversations, in your opinion, are really happening behind the scenes in boardrooms specifically that are dispelling that? Because what we've noticed is that we continue to see commitments that we're committing ourselves to this or that, pay equity or gender gap closing. International Women's, we're committed to making everybody feel included, but why is it that the lower end of that totem pole are the last to actually benefit from those commitments?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that. I think there is hope right now because of what we're talking about and the acceleration we're seeing. So take CEO pay ratio, for example. So that was something that was introduced, and it took 2 years for it to actually be incorporated into Dodd-Frank as law, and then 5 more years for it to become a regulation with the SEC. And even at that point, it was just performative. It was still performative, and it was a headline. It was a headline because everyone would come to their people and explain, well, she makes this much because she's in charge, and they would explain it away. I think what's happening now with the confluence of all these events, and particularly to answer your question around the boardroom, there has been a massive peopleification of the boardroom. The CHRO used to come in once every 5 board meetings, every 5 quarters, as kind of a cameo appearance. But now people issues are top billing every single board meeting. And because of the pressure from employees, I really do think that's acting as an accelerant that's driving legislation and regulation very quickly. I mean, if you think about CEO pay ratio and what we're seeing with median pay gap and pay transparency, it's compressed. We're moving very quickly from rules to laws to compliance, and I think that's going to help. I think the other thing that's going to help is just, we are in the middle of the biggest social movement in American history. And that pressure, I think, is going to force board of directors, CEOs, C-suites to actually take action, disclose their pay gaps, identify opportunities. Pay equity, of course, is always table stakes. But I do think we're in the midst of a great acceleration of these things that's going to drive us from the performative commitments that you're talking about that drive us all bonkers to true action.
Oh yeah, go ahead. I'll just recap in case you couldn't hear. In terms of private equity, in terms of making investments or buying small, medium, large companies, when you buy the company, you look in the hood and under the hood, and you see a whole bunch of issues here. Is that basically what your question is? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to take this one. What you're describing is very common, particularly in smaller privately held corporations where they've been doing things a certain way for a lot of times, and their incentives might be different than a larger corporation that maybe has shareholders or PR issues. that they have to deal with. So in that instance, when you're talking about the issues under the hood, one thing that I think that companies could do when they're in like the process of either acquisition, bringing them into your company or investing in them, is looking at two things. One, looking at, is there like a vision alignment, right? So like so-called cultural due diligence. Do these leaders align with what I'm trying to do, or are they going to be a blocker? And I think that there's certain ways to do that. There's interviews, there's certain kind of assessments that can be done, and then asking questions, right, about their policies, about their practices, about things that they've done, looking at any lawsuits that they've had, over the past 10 or so years, getting a sense of what the issues were, any employee complaints that were raised. And then again, looking at the data, and I think this is where technology can really help. In my experience, the deal timeline is so accelerated, right? And everyone's looking at different things and their emphasis on the bottom line. And once you have technology and something that's able to look at salaries and quickly group similar employees into buckets, then you could get a very quick and dirty look to say like, okay, this is generally looking okay, or oh geez, we really have a lot of work to do here. And frankly, that could be the deal breaker, right? If decide if this is what you want to do or not do, because reversing that process of either pay inequity or just shoddy pay practices, that takes a very long time to fix. And it's also the cultural and mental aspects and the change management aspect. So I understand everything that you're saying, and I think that some of those tools could be helpful.
Did you want to add there?
So I'm going to take a less optimistic approach to this. I don't think that, I started out by saying that the gap is only closed 20 cents in 50 years. And so even with pay transparency laws, anti-secrecy laws, audits, it's still not changing at the rate that we want to see it change, because there are organizational, institutionalized, these things are entrenched. This is not something you can just sort of unravel. Some companies, if there's a lot of liabilities, they might ignore them. They might not make the changes that you are talking about. So, I'm a little less optimistic in terms of the pace we will move to make these changes. I do think that you can do a pay audit. You can send in your pay data, because that is the law. That's very minimum, like just send me your data. It doesn't mandate any changes within the company. It doesn't say, if I find this, you will have 90 days or a year to make changes. That's not mandated. That's not happening. So I do think there's still more work to be done. I'm a part of this initiative. There's a new tech startup called Open Comp, which benchmarks salaries for startups and companies that are planning to go public. And so I think that companies who, from the very beginning, especially small companies, startups, who bake these kind of conversations in from the beginning, I think they have a fair shot at really addressing some of these pay gap issues. I think it is harder for bigger companies. And I have to say, people of color, when we go down the pay the pay scale, women, we do see that sometimes they get left behind in these discussions.
Anyone else? Oh yeah, go ahead.
This can be for all three of you, the culture issue that you mentioned. That's very hard to change. So I'm curious in your research, what you've seen that worked in transforming that aspect, which is very hard.
So I was asked this a while ago, or just on a panel the other day, and the question was framed, is there a way to, beyond performative, to create accountability, like measures, like, for CEOs, like a mandate at the top, so that you have to achieve particular metrics, which triggers, like, well, then in order to meet the metrics around pay equity or any other culture change, that means that you have to really think about how you're doing business and really examine your structures, your institutions, who's in power, who's in charge, but also without accountability, without a way to measure what we're talking about, there's not going to be any change. It is going to be performative. It is going to be working groups. We've all been a part of these DI, pay equity, gender working groups where you make a set of recommendations and they just land on the floor, and people shift. And so I think if we can figure out a way to measure, hold accountable, tie it to compensation for CEOs, like there, there's a lot of ways we can think about this that really would help us to shift the culture, and really examine the culture that sort of makes these things exist or persist.
I agree with what you're saying, and it's all about, for employers and leaders, how do we measure how we value our people at work? That's the critical part of this, is the measurement and the action. And there's a couple of things that companies must do. Number one, pay equity, table stakes. And it's not about outsourcing this to a law firm to do an audit once a year, and by the time you get the results back, they're stale and your people have moved and you've reorged and you've done a layoff and you've hired people and it doesn't even matter anymore. It's about doing this in an ongoing way. It's about looking at pay equity every time you hire someone, making sure that you're hiring them at a rate that's not just competitive, but it's also equitable with your internal folks. This is an always happening thing that you're looking at consistently. That's table stakes. The next is looking at how you're offering opportunities. So again, remember, the median pay gap is not about pay. It's about opportunities and promotion and movement. So figure out what you look like in terms of your representation, aspirationally what you want to look like, but don't set some BS aspirational goal. We want to be 25% people of color in our C-suite by 2048. That's garbage. If you hear companies saying that, they have no plan. They're just kicking the can down the road to their next leadership team. Set a goal that's achievable. Figure out how you're going to get there, and then identify what your pipeline looks like externally and internally, and then apply development resources for reskilling, upskilling to your current workforce, to the people that you have in play. Retaining your way to these goals is so much more efficient than hiring your way to these goals. Most of the time, you've got the people right there in your midst. You just have to put resources towards reskilling, upskilling your workforce. So commit to doing that. Figure out what you want to look like, and then track it over time using technology. How are you doing against those goals?
I also don't think people think about middle management enough. Like, when was the last time you hired someone and you're like, what are your thoughts on pay transparency? Like, I don't know how much that comes up in the interview process, and everyone focuses on the leadership at the top, which clearly matters, but also the real work is getting done in like the middle levels. And so to your point, I think that's also another area. It's like a domino effect. You get one person on board and then the next person and the next person. So.
And identify and use those measurement tools to figure out where your people are at and how you can offer them those opportunities to grow.
Great. Well, I think this is all the time we have. Thank you guys so much for joining us. Thank you very much to the panelists. Thanks again to Syndio, our presenting sponsor. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Remember, #Bloomberg Equality, and have fun.